As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're glad to have this returning guest. Alasdair MacLeod is the head of research at Gold Money. He's been with us several times before on Reluctant Preppers, and he's always a welcome guest from our viewers because he brings not only a perspective and an authority from his deep involvement in the precious metals community and world of finance, but he also brings a European perspective, which helps to give us a more balanced and thorough viewpoint to consider when we're assessing how we can be aware and prepared. Alasdair, thank you so much for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
That's very much my pleasure, Dunnigan.
We wanted to address with you today, if we could, a few questions that will circle back actually to themes that you opened up with us maybe 3 or 4 years ago when we first had you on, and they're related to considerations of risk reduction and how people hold and access their precious metals, gold and silver particularly, but also the relationship that's emerging and becoming more clear month by month of the synergistic versus competitive relationship of precious metals versus cryptocurrencies. So if we could start with the pretty simple question of where you hold your gold, and especially in this current era of increased geopolitical tensions as we see just burgeoning. We have a relative, a family member actually that we care very deeply about living in the Middle East, who's thinking that they're going to have to spend this weekend in another country because of tensions that are happening and potential risks there in the Middle East. And as people look at where they want to keep, if they're not fully trusting that their money in the bank is safe in the banker's hands, and they want to have more ability to direct and diversify, reduce risk of loss of access to their wealth or their nest egg or their insurance plan, whatever they consider precious metals to be, there's a very strong contingent that says if you don't hold it physically in your hands, and if you can't protect it with your own strength and your own arms or whatever, you don't have access to it because there's always this unacceptable counterparty risk and so on. But it's not a one-dimensional discussion because people are concerned also about people breaking and entering or loss of societal, normal, civil unrest, that kind of thing, and wanting to make sure that they are taking prudent action to safeguard their holdings. So you've talked with us in the past, years ago, about different options for storage of precious metals, and I wonder what your most recent thoughts are on that, what your most recent research and recommendations are for people to be considering.
Yes, surely. I think the first thing that you must understand is that you want to have ownership, not a promise to deliver gold. So you must have ownership. That's the first thing. So this rules out, say, instruments that represent gold, such as futures or options. It rules out also ETFs, because an ETF gives you the right to own a share in a pot of gold. You don't actually have ownership of gold. And always in all these structures, there is counterparty risk. And given that you are trying to protect yourself as a sort of insurance policy against the fiat currency system going wrong, it is desperately important that you have ownership. Now, there are two ways in which you can do that. The first and most obvious way is to store it at home. But as you rightly said, that gives you a problem that, you can be burgled, or indeed, if the whole system starts falling down and we end up with a police state, the police come knocking on your door and forcing you to hand it over. So what I would say is that any gold which you hold yourself has got to be relatively minimal. Now, this leaves you with a problem. Where do you hold the rest of your gold? And I think here you need to consider two things. Firstly, if it's going to be in a different jurisdiction from the one you're living in, which makes sense. It makes an awful lot of sense because it makes it harder for your government to grab hold of your gold if it's in another jurisdiction. You have to be confident in the property laws in that jurisdiction.
Right.
So this is very important. Now, this isn't necessarily an easy thing to understand. It does take a little bit of specialist knowledge, and so I would suggest that the individual does a little bit of research in this direction. Now, what you would then do is you would store your gold in a vault, a secure vault, in that jurisdiction where property rights are respected and are inviolable. They will never be violated. And the next question really is that because most of us don't have enough gold to go along and say to one of the vaulting companies, please store my gold, because they don't want to deal with individuals, quite honestly, because they've got all the the anti-money laundering regulations. They don't want to get involved. They just want to deal with recognized institutions or extremely large private clients. So you're not going to get anywhere going to a vault. So you need an agent, and that's where someone like Gold Money comes in. Now, if you're looking at someone like Gold Money, you want to make absolutely certain that the gold which Gold Money or Bullion Vault or one of these others holds for you is actually held as your property. In other words, the agent, in this case, I would suggest Gold Money, acts as custodian of your gold. Now, the next thing you need to know is let me just go on about that. Now, if Gold Money goes bust, then your property should be identified as your property, and it's not on Gold Money's balance sheet. That, I think, is fundamental. The second thing is that you're going to want to see an audit trail to make sure that our books and our records of what we hold in custody are correct. There are two audit trails that have to be made. The first is a metal audit, which basically means you get a specialist who is allowed into the vaults and who will verify that the gold or silver or platinum or whatever it is you hold actually does exist, and yes, it is there. The second audit is a monetary audit, a financial audit, to make sure that our books are correct in terms of recording that storage. You need those two audits. And this is something, if I can sort of widen it a little bit, this is one of the problems I think that the American government has. They do, or they have done in the past, a monetary audit. They said, the Treasury tells us that there is 8,134 tons of gold backing this note, full stop. We auditors can sign this off because we believe we have no right to question the U.S. Treasury. You don't get the monetary audit. That's actually what you. Sorry, the metal audit.
The physical audit.
That's
Right.
You want the two things. One is no good without the other. So, really, to summarize, you want no counterparty risk. You don't want to have the bulk of what you own in terms of precious metals in your own home, because it is, as you rightly pointed out, liable to be stolen from you or just lifted by the local police if things really get bad. You therefore need storage, and you need storage to be arranged in a country which has property rights which are very strong and won't be overturned through foreign relations. And lastly, the person who acts as custodian for your gold has got to be able to show an audit trail that identifies it as your property, both from a metal audit and also from a financial audit. And those have got to be done regularly.
Several questions arise just in hearing what you've just described, and I'm hoping that I'm able to fairly represent some of the main questions that some of our guests will have. But please, those of you who are watching this video, if you have additional questions that I don't think to raise or that Alasdair doesn't cover, please add them to the comments below the video, and we'll see if we can get them addressed. Okay, so one question that comes to mind is when you talk about jurisdictions that have upheld property rights, I guess they always say, when you're looking at a perspective, what do they say? Past results not guarantee future performance for most mutual funds, that sort of thing. But one of the concerns that people would have, especially in the last decade or two, is that what were considered previously to be highly private and unreachable countries where you could arrange, whether it was Swiss bank accounts or was Bahamian bank accounts or Grand Cayman or something like that, they were considered out of reach and having a long track record, or centuries long, whatever, of not cooperating with governments. Just seem to have been, I don't know if it's bullied or strong-armed or whatever, for whatever reason, in the last decade or so, into saying, okay, I guess we're going to cooperate with the U.S. government. We're going to tell them everything. I guess, are there still jurisdictions that you believe or have reason to believe are more independent or more private, that sort of thing? Because if they're doing this whole audit and providing you evidence with this ledger, then that ledger is available. It's could be provided to other authorities as well. So, and you didn't specifically say you were talking about privacy and secrecy. You said you were talking about clarity of ownership. So. I guess if you could first just address that, is there any place left on Earth that seems to be upholding the kind of expectation that you've been describing? And then what about privacy? Because I didn't hear you discussing that.
No, you're right. I think that privacy and ownership are two completely separate things.
Yep.
And I'm afraid in this modern world, governments have agreed with other governments, basically through the OECD, the basis of exchange of information. So that custody of assets and all the rest of it, if it's not actually, if let's say the US government can't actually access information about American citizens' ownership of gold in a foreign vault, I think they probably will in the not too distant future. Of that I have little doubt. So you need to separate out these things. I would suggest, and this is not going to be at all helpful, the only places where your gold will not be reported to the Americans is a vault in Russia, China, Iran. I don't think there are any vaults in Iran actually available to the public anyway. And there you've got different problems. Yeah. So, the reality today is that government have information on you, full stop. And all this stuff about data privacy and all the rest of it. As far as government is concerned, it doesn't apply to governments. It only applies to the private sector. So you have to keep your tax affairs in order. But what we're looking at is a situation where potentially there is a real credit crisis, and it leads to a currency crisis. By that, I mean the purchasing power of fiat currency going down, which at the same time would be reflected in the price of gold measured in those fiat currencies rising substantially. Right. That stage, and remember also, governments officially do not recognize, we're talking about the European governments and the American government, do not officially recognize that gold is money. They would regard your gold as an investment, not as an insurance, but as an investment. So they would look for you to report it as such. And obviously, you have to work within the rule of law in your jurisdiction. The only thing I would say is that it does make sense to store your gold in a different jurisdiction, because if things really go wrong and you need that protection, you don't want to have that gold readily accessible to your own government. You could, I suppose, under those circumstances, even leave the jurisdiction in which you live.
That's my next question, actually. So before you go there, yeah. If we could. Okay, but let's take a baby step at a time. So could you, I think in the past you've mentioned, I think Singapore, I can't think where else. Are there some sort of leading, like top of mind, top three jurisdictions that come to your mind as far as upholding property laws and that sort of thing that you describe?
Yes, I would say that Switzerland, I would say also Singapore, and possibly somewhere like Dubai. I think that probably brings a second set of risks in, which are to do with source of gold and all the rest of it. Because you've got this thing nowadays where, if gold is identified that it might have come from a conflict zone, then, that, if you like, could be the basis of you being forced to surrender it, because there isn't a clear trail, if you like, that an LBMA member would supply to guarantee that the gold comes from a clean source, as it were. So, you must be aware that governments are actually making everything very, very difficult. But the one thing that basically they can't do. They can tax you and all the rest of it. One thing that they can't generally do is take your property, because that effectively is communism.
Well, we've certainly got concerns expressed by members of the preparedness community and the community at large about levels of taxation, and about you mentioned earlier that you'll notice in times of hyperinflation or whatever, the value of the fiat currency going down. It's like people are saying, well, yeah, it's been going down for the last 100 years, so it'll just be a continuation of what we've already seen. It's actually policy. So both of those can be considered theft of property. But what about that differentiation of private segregated storage versus commingled storage? You made a point earlier about you've got to own the thing. You can't just own a certificate of a membership in a ETF or that sort of thing, or a promise to.
Yeah.
But so you physically have these many ounces of gold that are yours, belong to you. But what about the storage considerations of yours being the identity of your specific ounces of gold? Is that important?
No, in the sense of custody, no, it's not important. And typically, our customers' gold is stored in 400-ounce bars, so they have a portion of the bar, as it were, allocated to them. Equally, if our customers want delivery of their gold, we will deliver it to them. There's obviously a delivery charge and all the rest of it. So that there is always that backstop, if you like, if for some reason someone thinks, well, either I don't trust the system, I don't trust the vaulting system, I don't trust gold money, or I don't trust anyone having possession of my gold, I would rather have it delivered. We can deliver it too. We can arrange for that. But as long as it is in a vault, effectively what you have is part ownership of large bars. Right. It has to be that way, because if you're going to buy and sell gold, if you're going to have gold which is marketable, if you like, in the sense that it is exchangeable for anything, then it has to be in officially recognized bullion. It has to be either in LBMA standard bars or the Chinese 1 kilo standard. And again, you've got a list of refiners who are acceptable. And if the refiner is not on that list, the gold is not acceptable. It's as simple as that.
Now, in passing, you mentioned it, in the case of runaway inflation, where the price of precious metals measured in a collapsing fiat would appear to be skyrocketing, and that sure looks like a ripe taxation target for any government that's struggling. So that's where my mind went to, and you mentioned it, and I held you back for a minute, as far as, will people be wise to have thoughts ahead of time on where they might choose to relocate to a different jurisdiction that has different tax laws or different, and if so, are there specific resources that come to mind as far as where they can do more learning about the options they should consider in that regard?
Well, that is the sort of thing. I mean, how long is a piece of string? The piece of string you're talking about is extremely long, and I'm not quite sure where we cut into it. What I would suggest is that if you have, let us say, a cultural background from somewhere in particular, then you might be more comfortable going to somewhere where that cultural background is understood. I mean, so someone, let's say, from sort of a German background living in the United States might want to go to somewhere like Austria, or the German end of Switzerland, Zurich, somewhere like that. But then again, you've got other problems, and that is, can you get a visa? So that is yet another consideration. So if you can't get a visa, this is something which you probably don't put in your list, because really what you're looking for, I think, is somewhere to relocate in a relatively short notice, rather than, well, okay, it'll take 3 or 4 months to get a visa. We'll just go along with that. So this is not the easiest question really to answer. I know that various people have looked at places like Argentina and all the rest of it. Now, this is an interesting one, because as we know, the Argentine economy is absolutely trashed by government, and this is reflected in the currency, which is nosediving as we speak. But Argentina has always had a fairly large foreign community, and the foreign community are permitted to own assets and all the rest of it. So people buy farms, and they they live, I suppose, the sort of life that perhaps you lived in America 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago, insofar as it's nice wide open spaces, you've got ranches and all the rest of it, and it's sort of affordable. Places like New Zealand, again, I mean, what a wonderful country, but you really are in the middle of nowhere out there if that matters to you. Australia is another country which quite a lot of people are going to, but here again, with both Australia and New Zealand, they have immigration laws which are, and to put it very crudely, designed to keep Chinese out, or the huge numbers of Chinese out. And because we can't differentiate between Caucasians and Chinese and Indians and all the rest of it, I'm afraid that it's one law for everybody. So trying to get into somewhere to live in a country like that is not necessarily easy. But if you just want to sort of disappear off and live in a hotel for a few weeks while things settle down, then I suppose that might be a possibility.
If we could turn our attention, and thank you for that discussion. I'm sure it opened as many questions as it settled for people.
I think it does. I think it does.
It does bring us up to date on your latest thinking on that, and we really do appreciate that. If we could turn our attention to the role and the relationship between precious metals and cryptos that has been emerging. This could be a whole nother topic of great depth, but if we could at least just hit the high points in your mind of whether we have any clarity emerging that cryptocurrencies and precious metals are allies in protecting the individual against the risks of a fiat system, and if so, how so?
Okay. I think the first thing to understand is that cryptocurrencies are, in terms of status, exactly the same as fiat currencies. How they behave, of course, is very, very different. Basically, what you have in a cryptocurrency is something that only has value because people believe it has value. It is not money. It is a speculative counter. In exactly the same way that paper currency is not money. You don't regard it as a speculative counter. You regard it as a money substitute. So those are basically the small differences. Gold and silver, and particularly gold, is very, very different. It is not in that category at all. Gold is accepted everywhere in the world as the default form of money. And you can't say that about cryptocurrencies. And obviously, you can't say that about fiat currencies because fiat isn't a default. Well, someone else's fiat might be default, but that's only sort of fairly temporary, as it were. So if you look at cryptocurrencies in that sense, people look at cryptocurrencies as a means, if you like, of diversifying out of paper currencies, fiat currencies. So here, actually what they're doing is they're looking at it rather like they might look at a gold future as a diversification out of the fiat currency. In other words, they are looking at a speculative position. They're not looking long-term, it is speculative. Gold is very much long-term. That is your nest egg. You have put it aside against a rainy day, which might be this year, next year, 10 years. Who knows? That, if you like, is something that gives me comfort for the future. Cryptocurrencies don't do that. Cryptocurrencies have the promise of enormous speculative gains in the short term. Now, in order to understand where we are in that, the way I look at all bull markets is they happen in three phases. The earliest phase is the one where very few people really get involved. And in that early phase, you find that the people who are very close to the industry, or, if you're talking about mining or something like that, the people who really are the professionals in the business. And in the case of cryptocurrencies, we're talking about the geeks, if you like, if I can just call them that. They understand what's going on. They bought Bitcoin at 30 cents, and they have still got them at $930 odd. They've probably sold a bit along the way. They have made an awful lot of money, and they're very, very happy. Now, obviously, as that progresses, more and more people who don't understand what they're doing do get involved, and they go and buy some at the top, and they lose some money and all the rest of it. And so the whole thing quietens down. Then the second phase starts, and that is when the institutions start getting involved. And particularly with the lack of volatility and the enhanced downside risk that I think hedge funds are beginning to see in equities. They want something else to play with. So that you can see that people like Goldman Sachs are beginning to make a market in cryptocurrencies. I mean, we're doing it at Gold Money as well, with about 2 or 3 of them. The institutions can begin to get involved a bit more. They've got a problem in that their compliance officers turn around and say, this is not a regulated investment. But guess what? You now have a future, a Bitcoin future, which is a regulated investment. So because that is regulated, they can now begin to play it. And it spreads from there because, if I'm a hedge fund manager, I say to my compliance guy, I say, look, this is regulated on COMEX. I don't want to buy COMEX because I think that there is counterparty risk against that market. I would rather have physical ownership of Bitcoin myself. Now you, Mr. Compliance Officer, have to produce a strong argument to prevent me doing so, given that it is already regulated on COMEX. So you can see how, the door is just being prized open for the institutions, and particularly when very, very important banks like Goldman Sachs start making a market, then, this is sending signals to anyone in the investment community who thinks this is something I ought to begin to follow, maybe invest in. So that begins, and you get a momentum, and you get more hedging instruments, financial instruments associated with cryptocurrencies as that second phase develops. Now, that second phase, I would expect to take the price of, if you like, the more established cryptocurrencies well above the previous high. We then have some sort of consolidation because the whole thing gets sort of somewhat out of hand, and the consolidation can be quite sharp. And it would probably bring it back, say, from, and these are purely hypothetical numbers to give you an idea of the scale of things. But if, let's say, on this run, it runs up to something like $50,000, it might come back to something like, I don't know, $35,000 and hurt an awful lot of people in the process. But then, because everybody realizes that these things are here to stay, you then get the last phase, and that is when you get very widespread public involvement. Now, at that stage, we've got to start comparing cryptocurrencies with previous speculative bubbles. Now, if I look at a speculative bubble which, is, again, just pure hot air, something like the tulip bubble in Amsterdam all those centuries ago, who was able to play with that? Well, there were 2 things. Firstly, you had to be within a coach ride of the market in tulips. In other words, you couldn't be very far away in order to go and play the game. You didn't have the communications you got now. You can't pick up a phone to a broker and say, buy me a ton of blue tulips. No, you can't do that. You have to actually go there with your gold, and you have to give it to your broker, and he then goes into the market and buys you a ton of tulips or whatever whatever it is. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the availability of money and credit. In those days, unless you were very much an established member of the tulip community, you would have no credit at all. You actually had to have cash on the nail. That limited the scope, if you like, of the market, because that gold had to be taken from being used for something else. If I had a business, let's say, making wooden clogs, sort of outside Amsterdam.
I get it, the Holland reference. Okay.
Yeah, then I would have to take my capital out of my clog-making business in order to speculate in the tulips. But now we have a different thing. We have bank credit. You and I can go along to the bank. In fact, we can just get our credit card and we can say, lend us some money. We don't have to tell the bank what we're doing. And we can go up and we can buy a few $1,000s worth of Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever it is, so that you have got expandable money, which doesn't have to be taken from doing something else. It's just created out of thin air for you to speculate with. And then a final point. In the old days, when you were within a coach ride of Amsterdam to play the tulip game, the total population that were able to do this was actually pretty limited. So this amazing bubble probably involved no more than 10,000 people, but it was an amazing bubble. Now, you could just have a mobile phone and you can have an app. And you have got the potential of a 7 billion person market playing these things. I'm not saying that's how it'll end up, but you can see that the normal restrictions that you have on a speculative bubble do not appear to apply in the case of these cryptocurrencies. Now, before you get absolutely, or before any of your viewers get carried away with the thought, oh, we've got to have this and all the rest of it, there is also the interplay of the credit cycle. And we're going to get a credit crisis, in my view, probably towards the end of this year. That is going to be a major complication in the whole thing. It could be that governments very rapidly agree to shut down the cryptocurrency business. But I would say that if the institutions are very much involved, it's going to be more difficult for them to do so.
Right.
So that's one thing to watch. The other thing I would say about it is that we are now looking, and this is where my original point was so important to understand, that cryptocurrencies are effectively the same status as fiat currency. If you find that your fiat currency is going down, one of the ways in which you will protect yourself, or could protect yourself, is to sell your fiat currency and buy a cryptocurrency. And that is probably going to be very easy for you to do for the reasons I said, and also emotionally easy to do, because you'll see that the dollar's going down, the dollar's buying less tomorrow than it did yesterday, and therefore there's not much point in me holding onto my bank deposits in the bank. I'd be far better having some Ethereum or whatever it is. Now, that can only fuel the relationship between cryptocurrencies and paper currencies, fiat currencies, pushing paper currencies down more rapidly than they would otherwise go in a paper currency collapse.
It gives an alternative for people to bail out into, so more rats can leave the sinking ship faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But the danger in this is that governments will wake up to this danger, and they will stop you doing it. So if you put all your money into cryptocurrencies, there is the risk that you might not get it. And this is why you've got to understand the relationship between cryptocurrencies and fiat currencies, and why gold is in a completely different category. Meanwhile, it's a pretty good game in town, I would suggest.
We're running short on time, but I wanted to give you a chance to update us on the status of what I think used to be called BitGold, but you've been calling it, I think, the Gold Money Card more recently, and how people can do transactions in fractional units that without having to actually transact in whole, coins of gold or whatever, that sort of thing, and yet find something that's accepted anywhere because it's recognized to be backed by or supported by actual physical precious metals. Can you give us an understanding of that briefly?
Yes, of course. I mean, basically, the card is a facility for you to be able to mobilize your gold. It's only gold. It can't apply to silver because the bulk storage of silver makes it impractical for us to store it free of charge for you. But if you have gold held with us and you have a card, and we can give you a card in dollars, sterling, euros, Swiss francs, I think. Anyway, the major currencies, you can have a card in that. Then basically what you do is you preload your card. So you would, in your case, you would sell some gold for dollars, load that on your dollar card, and then you can just spend it. It's a MasterCard. You just spend it as. The limit on it, obviously, is the amount of currency that you've loaded your card with. So what it does is it allows you to mobilize your gold as money. And this is just one of a number of things we're doing. I mean, one of the things that we're doing in association with James Turk is these are really for larger customers. We can you can use your gold or silver to lend to someone else. So this would be rather like a deposit, if you like, making it work for you. And you get paid interest. You get paid interest in gold or silver or however you like to contractually set it. So that's lend, borrow, trust, which my colleague John Butler is now CEO of. And the other thing, which is a lot more fun than that serious topic, is Roy Sabag has launched Mene, which is a new line of 24-karat jewelry, which trades at, it's sold at a premium, a small premium, relatively small premium, over the gold value, with a buyback guarantee. And so this is, if you like, replicating the situation in India, where Indians typically wear their gold as jewelry, and it is, if you like, the family pension fund in that sense. And I must say that is going that's going crazy, that business. It really is very, very popular. So we're not just a one-trick pony now.
It's quite interesting, and I hadn't heard about that last one from you specifically. So if you could give people an indication of where they can find out more about all these topics that we've talked about and the research writings that you've done about them.
Yeah. Well, I would Google Mene. I think it's mene.com. That's MENE.com.
All right.
And goldmoney.com. And offhand, I don't know what the Lend Borrow Trust thing is. That's a peer-to-peer business, by the way. And that, again, is going very, very well. So those are the three things. But if you go to the Gold Money site, Google will take you anywhere you want to go as well. So it's easy to access.
Well, we've been talking with Alasdair MacLeod. He is the head of research at Gold Money. He's been talking with us about where we can store our gold, the relationship between cryptos and gold, and the Gold Money card and ways to mobilize your gold. Alasdair, it's always interesting and thought-provoking. It reminds us that there's no trivially simple answers. These all take careful reflection, but you're helping us to increase our awareness so that we can make prudent choices. And there isn't any one right choice. And people who make comments here will certainly have their opinions, but that doesn't mean that there's only one right choice here. So we're just trying to understand and broaden our awareness of the options that are available to reasonable individuals so they can make wise choices for their family and their well-being. Thank you, as always, so much for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
That's very much my pleasure, Duncan.